So let's talk about the main culprits where I find relational trauma happens the most, the main causes. So if this could be an umbrella, I'd like you to think about emotional neglect and abandonment as the umbrella that all these other things fall into. Under that umbrella, we have shaming and blaming. We have inverted relationship, emotional incest, psychological control, and enmeshment. I'm just checking time. Okay, we're good. So let's start with emotional neglect and abandonment. What I mean, let's talk about the needs, emotional needs of every human being and every child. And that is to feel safe, to feel loved unconditionally and understood and respected. I spoke a little bit about that before. These are emotional core needs of every child. And a lot of the time, safety and love are very much interwoven. And what happens when a parent's unable to meet the emotional needs of that child, that safety is, that caretaker is no longer a safe place for that child. Well, as we grow up, our relationships that we seek out are going to mimic those of our caretakers. So if I had a mentally ill mom who wasn't able to be there for me, or a parent with an addiction problem, or more insidiously, I've found a parent who has not dealt with their own relational trauma. And in our parents' generations, that is a lot of them, for sure, to no fault of their own, just not a lot of resources out there. So a parent who hasn't dealt with their own relational trauma or their own trauma is not going to be the safest, most secure caretaker for a child. They will tend to be much more inconsistent with providing unconditional love, acceptance, safety, feeling understood. So I'm sure you can all imagine like what is meant by shaming and blaming. Shaming and blaming, what's interesting about that is that it is a way to get kids to behave. And when it's used as a tool in dysfunctional relationships is when it really can damage that child. The other thing about shaming and blaming, which is interesting that I've found, is that a lot of parents can be clueless about the way that they shamed or blamed their child, because in their mind, they don't see it that way. They saw it as disciplining or reprimanding. A lot of the time, parents will miss the shaming cues of a child. So every person reacts to shame differently. Some people get really angry when they feel ashamed. Other people kind of cave into themselves and they get really quiet and kind of, a cowed head and a small voice, while other people get really big and puffed out and kind of like bigger, their energy gets bigger. If the parent doesn't acknowledge or know when their child is having a shame reaction, they can't correct it, even if they didn't mean to shame their kid. So parents always come at parenting with the best of intentions. That's what I've learned in working with adolescents, especially. A lot of the times they just miss the cues of a child being ashamed because of something that they did or because of being reprimanded. And they miss the cues a lot of the time because of their unresolved trauma, because their parents missed the cues. Again, multi-generational. So inverted relationship is different than enmeshment, which is a more familiar term that I think most of you guys have heard of, an enmeshed relationship. Another word is codependent relationship. I'm not a huge fan of the word codependent, but we'll talk about that later. That's a little bit more towards enmeshment though. Inverted is a little bit different. And I want to make the distinction. It's a subtle distinction, but one of the leaders in attachment, the founder of attachment theory, John Bowlby, talks a lot about inverted relationships. And what he means, the example he gives a lot is a child will have a difficult time making friends outside of the family. That's because of his really close relationship with his mother. And almost always the issue is with the mother. They found that kids who have a hard time making friends outside families because they're so close with their mom or dad, actually is because the parent has an insecure attachment style. They have their own insecurities and their own anxieties, and they have made their children secure attachments for them, which in some people see that as abusive, because it's the child is taking care of the parent instead of the parent taking care of the child. So the child is being burdened with having to care for their mom or dad instead of vice versa. So just a little kind of diagram for that. If you see the arrows, you know, with a functional connection or relationship, the arrows are going that the caretaker, the grown-up, the arrows are pointing towards the young child, and that is functional bonding. That is a loving, affirming, nurturing, limit-setting type of relationship. When the kid is taking care of or uses the child to take care of themselves, that is aversion, an inverted relationship, and it's abusive because it uses the child to take care of themselves as the parent. The reason why I don't call this relationship enmeshed is because just because the parent is using the child to take care of themselves doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there's a loss of autonomy, emotional autonomy, meaning it doesn't necessarily mean that that the child feels what the mother's feeling and the mother feels what the child's feeling, and there's no separation, emotional separation between the two. As a matter of fact, a lot of the times in an inverted relationship, the child will feel very burdened by the fact that they have to take care of their caretaker, and will end up putting, when they're adults, really high walls in between them and relationships. So they'll be very walled off. I'm going to talk about that a lot more in part 2, what happens to us because of these causes. So whereas in an enmeshed relationship, boundaries are super skewed, which they are here, but emotional autonomy is lost, whereas maybe not in an inverted relationship. Okay. This, I believe, is the least talked about, the most insidious, and probably the most important thing that that I want to talk about tonight, and I hope that can shed some light on some things for all of you. So emotional incest. Emotional incest is a relationship where the child is taking care of the parent, so just like that diagram. So the child's taking care of the parent, but on top of that, the parent has very uncontained sexual energy that is being put onto the child. I say that emotional incest is incredibly insidious because there never has to be any physical contact between between the caretaker and the child. So the parent or caretaker never has to sexually, physically abuse that child for there to be very similar symptoms of sexual abuse later on in life. Okay, so signs of emotional incest is happening. It's almost as if the child's hypervigilance, meaning like their heart rate will go up when they're around the caretaker that has emotion, that there's emotional incest with. There's just a sense of dread, kind of not wanting to be in the same room as them, or constantly, if they are in the same room, just kind of looking to get out. Hugs, physical contact in general just feels in the body disgusting. A hug from a parent should feel safe and warm and safe, period. When there's emotional incest happening, that child is picking up on an energy that is inappropriate, completely inappropriate. And so they try to avoid physical contact. This is not a political statement whatsoever about, our POTUS or anything. So it's the way that he talks about his daughter. If she wasn't my daughter, I would date her. Look at her, she's so beautiful. She'd be in trouble, if, she wasn't my daughter. That is completely inappropriate talk to have for your daughter. To even create the scenario for your daughter to imagine that you could date her, or that if you guys weren't related, you'd be sexually attracted to her. Just sexualizing your children is a symptom of emotional incest. It makes that child feel, incredibly uncomfortable, to say the least. But it's also, that's your job, to protect your kids from being sexualized. And here parents are actually sexualizing their children. So making comments, objectifying your children, sexualizing your children, other things that parents can do or other things that emotional incest kind of has the air of is parents, may touch their children after a certain age, like, pinching their butts or patting their butts after a certain age where the kid feels uncomfortable. It's a little bit like, why is, she or he pinching my ass and I'm, a teenager now, or something of that nature. So again, it's like a missing link of boundaries. It's something's not quite connecting with the parent around containment. So when I talk about boundaries, and I'll talk a lot more about this in the next talk, we are talking about boundaries being things that protect us from the world, like putting a wall up, but also talking about containment, protecting the world from us so that we don't offend others with our physical touch, emotional, emotions, intellectual, things of that nature. I hope everyone understands that, what I just talked about with emotional incest. Okay, how are we on time? Good. Okay, psychological control. So the easiest way I can, an example of psychological control is, again, it's used as a tool because it works. So in a dysfunctional caretaking relationship, psychological control is like the bread and butter of a way to control your child or control the person you love in relationship. One of the biggest things that can happen with that is taking the love away. So when dad gets angry, he stops talking to me. And that feels really, really terrible. What your dad just did is that he made his love be a consequence of your actions, which in behavioral control, I hate that term, but that is like the scientific term for it. Behavioral control, there's no taking the love away. So behavioral control is actually, another word for it is authoritative parenting. It's actually, studies show that it is an incredible tool to use in parenting. It is structure and kindness in balance, whereas psychological control might be a lot of structure but no kindness. It's using kindness as a weapon instead of a tool. So you have the shaming and blaming in psychological control as well, and all these other things that are mentioned here. So with authoritative parenting or behavioral control, you've got that structure, you've also, and limit setting, but you also have the kindness and you have the responsiveness to emotional needs. So warm and nurturing. Okay, now we get to enmeshment. So enmeshment, the best way I can describe it, enmeshment happens when a child and parent's emotional, intellectual, and physical boundaries are non-existent towards each other. So what I was talking about with inverted relationships, so okay, so in the rehab facility that I used to work at for young adults, whenever I would get have these kind of like carefrontations, so the families would come in and they would kind of, you know, hear all the ways that they hurt their son or daughter, and then the son or daughter would hear the ways that they hurt their parents, and we would have them sit in chairs, and I would say, just however close or distant feels comfortable to you, and the person who wants the most distance gets that, basically. So whoever needs the most distance, they kind of set the stage. An inverted relationship, the parent will want to be very close, but the child will want to be kind of further away. In meshed relationship, they're so close, their knees are knocking, and I ask them to stand up, their faces almost touch. And then I say to them, does that feel a little too close? And they're like, oh yeah, totally. But they would never see it without somebody pointing out, hey, this needs to be kind of, you know, let's step back a little. So here's another diagram to kind of help understand this. So if you look at the dots being kind of emotionally what the parent is going through. So let's take a shameless or shame-filled caretaker. Pain-filled caretaker that doesn't acknowledge pain, and raging or rarely angry caretaker. So all those, you know, those yin and yangs are the same thing. They're both unhealthy. Being shameless or being filled with shame and not dealing with it, being pain-filled and not dealing with it, and raging or rarely getting angry, not dealing with it, you are going to be leaking all of that onto your child. So the child will feel worthless. They'll really be feeling worthless for their parent, but they don't know that because they're enmeshed. So they just feel worthless, and they don't know that it's carried worthlessness. It's not their worthlessness. It's their parents' worthlessness. They don't realize that it's not their rage they're carrying. It's actually their parents' rage, because dad or mom is a rageaholic. A parent who acts shameless and blameless will spit that all onto the kid, and the kid will feel immense shame that is never theirs. It's actually their parents. So we talked a lot about this. Yeah, a lot of times enmeshment, when I ask kids what their relationship is with the parents, and they'll, or the parent will say, we're each other's best friends. We tell each other everything. She's just like the coolest mom, or he's the coolest dad, or they're the coolest kind of caretaker, or whatever. Let me do whatever I want. That kind of are red flags for me, where I need to dig a little bit deeper into what's going on.